Ursula's Attic, chapters 21 and 22. Chapter 21. Cloudy with a 10% chance of death. At any given time, there are believed to be 10 rogue waves somewhere in the world, massive mountains of water that exist for no particular reason other than the random compounding of small chaotic forces, from gravity to tides to wind to movements of fish. When all this randomness converges, nothing in its path can withstand the surge. But since the oceans are so immense, the vast majority of rogue waves go unnoticed, and unless, of course, you happen to be in the path of one. That afternoon, the convergence of random forces upon Nick's house was going to leave one of those forces dead in the water. The only question was, who would it be? Random force number 1, Danny. Danny could not have been happier with the week's turn of events. People were already calling him Danny the Star Catcher, which could have been a bad thing if people weren't really impressed by it. Rumors were already circulating that he was part of a government project, and the fact that his father had a secret job repairing copy machines for NORAD gave the rumors some weight. Whenever he was asked about it, Danny quoted a line from one of his favorite movies, Ninja Nanny 3, and told them, "I'm sworn to secrecy about it. All I can tell you is that I'm a registered weapon." It made the bullies too scared to do anything but sneer, and most everyone else vie for his attention. In fact, several kids at school had their cell phones confiscated when they tried to take pictures of him to post online. And just when he thought things couldn't get any better, today he'd gotten an A for his presentation on the Transcontinental Railroad, which included an authentic iron railroad spike that he had painted gold and secured to a wooden base point up. It was a pain in the neck to carry it home on the bus, but he wasn't going to part with something he had worked on so hard, no matter how dangerous the bus driver thought it was. "You'll put somebody's spleen out," the driver had said, but Danny wasn't worried. It was destined for a shelf in his room at a safe distance from any random spleen. Of course, for now, he was satisfied to leave it in the front hallway, along with his backpack, completely forgotten as he went to turn on the TV. To his frustration, the TV screen still showed nothing but static. What? He knew the cable guy was supposed to come that day, somewhere between 8 a.m. and the end of time. But no one to let him in? Who knew if they'd ever have cable? As Danny pondered the hellish idea of the television-free existence, the doorbell rang, and he hopped up, almost tripping over the golden spike as he answered the door. It was not the cable guy, however, but that creepy dude, Vince, carrying something that looked like a car battery. "Oh, it's you. Where's your brother?" Vince asked. "How should I know?" Then Nick barged into the house from the backyard with an armful of junk, allowing Danny to get back to the business at hand. Bemoaning his media blackout, he hurled himself onto the old sofa to wait for the cable guy. He landed with such force that it summoned up a cloud of dust and shook the heavy portrait of Great Aunt Greta on the wall above him, loosening the framing hook. Random force number 2, Vince. Vince suspected that Nick was going to try to convince him to give up the wet cell. He almost didn't bring it, but there was a small chance that Nick was calling with new and previously unconsidered way to use it. Vince, of course, had his own thoughts about that. For instance, he could set up his own private detective agency, solve crimes by secretly talking to the deceased, like a show he saw on TV once. There was definitely money to be made. Unfortunately, there weren't enough murders in Colorado Springs to really make a business of it. He'd have to go to a larger criminal capital, like Bogota or Denver. "Good you're here," Nick said when he saw Vince. "You got it?" Vince held the wet cell a little higher so Nick could see it over the stack of stuff he was carrying. All items from the attic, no doubt. "Good. Bring it upstairs." "Why, so it can go back into the attic and rot for another 75 years? I don't think so." "Do it, Vince," Caitlin said on her way in with a few antiques as well. "I think he's on to something." on something, you mean. You can't have it back, period. What do you think I'm going to do? Burn it? Nick said, and Caitlin uncountably laughed. Just let me borrow it, okay? I promise you won't be disappointed. And if I am? Correct me if I'm wrong, said Caitlin, but isn't disappointment where you live? Vince had to admit it. She had a point, and he followed them up to the attic. Random force number 3. Theo. Theo was not stupid. It took a huge amount of intelligence to calculate exactly how little schoolwork he could get away with doing and still pass all of his classes. In fact, he prided himself on manipulating his GPA to being exactly where he wanted it to be, C minus, because when it came to college acceptance, grades wouldn't mean a thing until high school, at which time he would start miraculously getting A's, which his overjoyed parents would reward by buying him a car. He would manage his GPA the way his father managed stock portfolios, and that would get him into at least half the universities he was interested in, with or without a baseball scholarship. Then, once he was in college, he could go back to getting C minuses again. He had this thing wired. So skilled was Theo at being mediocre that he deeply identified with Nick's dad, who, according to Theo's research, was a pretty mediocre baseball player. Whiffin Wayne, as he was known during his 2 short years with the Tampa Bay Rays, was a pretty good pitcher, but his pitching wasn't stellar enough to shut down the nickname. Poor guy. What he needed was a fan, and what Theo needed was a way to wedge himself between Nick and Caitlin. As they say, this could be the big inning of a wonderful friendship. Theo lurked behind a hedge, out of view of Nick's home, until he saw Nick's father drive up and park. The man grabbed 2 takeout bags from the car, and Theo intercepted him before he got to the front door. Mr. Slate, could I talk to you for a second? He put on his best shucks expression, which worked well on girls, adults, and certain breeds of dogs. Yes, the man said, a little apprehensively. I know you're Nick's father, but I was just wondering, are you also the Wayne Slate of the Tampa Bay Rays? Nick's dad stood just a little bit straighter. You've heard of me? Theo took precisely 3 steps closer. Heard of you? Are you kidding me? You're the only pitcher who ever struck out Tyler Spornak twice in the same inning. Slate chuckled. Nothing to be proud of, getting all the way through the batting order in a single inning. Nah, if you don't mind me saying so, you're seeing the grass half empty. You were the best thing the Rays had going for them back then. I bet you'd taken them all the way to the World Series if you didn't blow out your pitching arm. Mr. Slate looked at Theo in disbelief. How do you know all of this? You were a little kid when I played. I'm a pitcher too. Historical perspective is an important part of the game. Then Theo took one more step forward and delivered the winning fastball. I would be honored if you'd sign this for me, sir. And he presented an official Topps baseball card featuring Wayne Slate, looking a little bit leaner and a little bit younger than he did today. It had cost Theo $1.50 on eBay and $25 for overnight delivery. If all else failed, the signed card might earn him back his investment. What do you know? The man said, shaking his head. I used to have a bunch of these, but we lost them in the fire. You got a pen? Theo checked his pockets, which he already knew to be empty. Darn, I forgot one. Duh. Why don't you come inside? Said Slate. I didn't get your name. Theodore, he said with a winning smile. I'm a friend of Nick's. In that case, why don't you join us for dinner? He held up the large takeout bags he was carrying in his card-free hand. Smells good. What is it? Thai. Cool. Never had Thai before. Which wasn't surprising considering the fact that Thai cuisine relies heavily on peanuts. Random force number 4, Caitlin. At first, Caitlin was sure Nick was out of his mind when it came to his new theory that all the objects fit together somehow. However, as they positioned and repositioned them in the center of the attic, Caitlin could see that the odd shapes and unnecessary grooves and divots in the framework of each device were not mere decoration. Yes, they were individual inventions with remarkable properties, but they were also puzzle pieces, and Caitlin had to accept that the real reason for her denial was that she hadn't even thought of it first. After all, she was the visual artist with a keen dimensional sense. She had to admit, though, that since she had known him, Nick had had several moments of genius like inspiration, grasping the big picture in a way no one else had. It made her like him all the more. Nick and Vince figured out the placement of the wet cell, and not to be outdone, Caitlin finally made the missing visual connection. She lowered the clear egg-shaped salon-style hairdryer over the bulb of the stage light. As soon as it was in place, it clamped on and stayed there, with the bulb in its center. Excellent, said Nick. The light was the only object that had a power cord, but he didn't plug it in. At the garage sale, it had attracted buyers by the dozen. Caitlin wondered exactly what it might attract now if he turned it on, and then she decided she'd rather not know. We're still missing too many pieces, Nick said. Are you sure you want to put the entire thing together? Caitlin asked. I mean, Tesla was a genius, but he also was a lunatic, right? Who knows what this thing will do? Nick didn't offer an answer. Maybe he was uncertain, as she was, even incomplete. The strange device was taking shape like the intricate gearwork of a clock. Caitlin could already imagine it humming and sparking with lightning, doing whatever it was that it did. Nick, Caitlin, and Vince considered the objects for a moment more, and then Nick said, Hey, what about the hair curlers? They're still out back, said Caitlin. I'll go get them. She went down the attic ladder and then to the main staircase on the first floor. Then, as she hurried through the kitchen toward the back door, her brain did a serious double take. Why was Theo sitting at the kitchen table with takeout in front of him? She turned slowly, fully convinced it must be someone else, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but Theo was still right there, leaning back with a smug look on his face, just waiting to be noticed by her. What are you doing here? She heard herself ask. Theo shrugged, like it was nothing. Can I hang out with my friend Nick Slade and his famous father? Caitlin was rarely speechless. Her mouth opened and closed a few times like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she wrangled her brain enough to say, Huh? Yes, said Theo, crossing his arms. I'm a regular friend of the family now. Mr. Slade's down in the basement at this very moment digging up some sports paraphernalia as we speak. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Theo told her. And from now on, Nick and I are going to be stuck together like toupees in a pod. Caitlin gaped at him. In fact, Theo continued, I plan to be here every time you are. Who said three's a crowd? The idea of Theo poisoning the air between Caitlin and Nick by his presence was unthinkable. Awkward didn't even begin to describe it. Her sort of ex-boyfriend hanging out with her kind of prospective boyfriend was almost enough to make her head explode. But of course it wouldn't. Making her head explode was the job of the miniature Tesla coils she was about to innocently retrieve from the backyard. Random force number 5. Petula. Petula had always admired Almira Gulch's perfect posture as she rode her bicycle up to Dorothy's house. With modern bicycles, however, such posture was impossible unless one didn't hold the handlebars. Thus, Petula had become a master of what she called Venus de Milo cycling. In other words, riding without arms. Of course, this left her with no brakes, but then Petula was not one to stop for anything, which is why she was nearly turned into roadkill by the Lifeline cable truck that careened into Nick's driveway and screeched to a halt mere inches from her. What's wrong with you? Petula screamed at random force number 6, the cable guy. But she didn't wait for a response. He was the cable guy. It was a sufficient answer to her question. She jumped off her moving bike with practiced skill and let it roll into Nick's lawn, where it lost momentum and fell over. Here's what Petula knew. At precisely 4:30, a dead body would be carried on a stretcher out of Nick's house to an ambulance waiting in the driveway. But exactly when the death itself was to occur, she had no idea. Nor did she know who the victim would be. There was no way to tell from the image whether the lump beneath the sheet was male or female. Frankly, she didn't care who it was as long as it wasn't Nick. She entered the house without knocking or ringing the doorbell, and she practically tripped over a mounted gold spike that was in the doorway for no reason that she could figure. Nick's annoying little brother brushed past her, shouting, "The cable guy's here! The cable guy's here!" like Paul Revere might have said, had he been more interested in watching the British arrive on CNN. There seemed to be quite a lot of activity in the house. She rushed through the rooms, taking quick stock of the situation. There were more people present than she expected. Vince was coming down the stairs from the second floor with Nick. Then there was a man, presumably Nick's father, shouting from the basement, "I'm still looking. I know it's down here somewhere." Caitlin was in the kitchen staring at Theo, and what Theo was doing there is nobody's guess. This was actually good news. As the cable guy entered the mix, Chola quickly calculated the odds. There was only 1 in 7 chance that Nick would buy the farm, her father's favorite euphemism for kicking the bucket. Of course, those were the odds if she didn't include herself. And then it dawned on her that there was no reason to exclude herself. Now that she was there, she was equally at risk from farm purchase. She ran up the stairs toward Nick, shoving Vince aside. Vince fell the rest of the way, almost but not quite breaking his neck. Close, but no cigar. "What's wrong with you?" said Vince. "Popular question today," said the cable guy, as he walked toward the living room, giving Petula a wink that was just on the cusp of being creepy. Petula ignored it and turned to Nick. "Come with me," she said. "You're in danger." "What are you talking about?" She grabbed him by the shirt and started shaking him. "Don't you understand, you idiot? I'm trying to save your life." "From what?" She slapped him, the way they do in the movies, to knock some sense into him. But he just proceeded to slap her back, which made her so furious that she slapped him again. Caitlin, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs, apparently saw enough of the exchange to say, "Can I slap Petula too?" "Be my guest," said Nick, pushing past Petula so he could take the object Caitlin was holding out to him. Something resembling a set of old-fashioned hair curlers. "What is she even doing here?" Caitlin asked Nick. For Petula, it was one of her personal pet peeves to be spoken of in the third person, but before she could level a complaint against either of them, the two were hurrying back up the stairs. In an instant, they had disappeared into the attic. The idea of Caitlin and Nick being alone in the attic did not sit well with Petula, although it did make her feel better to know that Caitlin had 1 in 8 chance of dying today. Perhaps she thought Nick was a serial killer, and he was at this very moment strangling her in the attic. If so, Petula would keep his dark secret, and it would bond them together for eternity. But Petula knew she couldn't count on that. What she needed was to improve the odds for Nick and herself by adding someone else to the equation, someone who stood a much larger chance of spontaneously dropping dead. And wasn't there a frail old woman who lived next door? Random force number 7. Mitch. Mitch knew that Nick was going to ask him for the shut up and listen because the machine had told him so. But the machine also told him it was best to do what Nick asked, regardless of how much phrased the first half of the sentence. So with the device in hand, he went to Nick's house. The last thing he expected to see as he approached the house was Petula practically dragging random force number 8, an old woman, across the lawn toward Nick's front door. A small dog in a knit sweater that embarrassed both the dog and the sheep that it had come from angrily nipped at Petula's heels. "We need your help. Hurry!" Petula screamed in the old woman's ear. "Someone's dying. Someone's dying." "Dying?" asked Mitch. "Who's dying?" Petula looked at him, seemingly put off by the question. "I don't know yet," she snapped at him, and then she continued to the house with the old woman, pushing her through the front door. Petula had so many endearing quirks that prior to yesterday's kiss, Mitch might have misinterpreted as irritants. He smiled at the thought. Popping a jawbreaker into his mouth that was curiously the exact same diameter as his windpipe, Mitch stepped into the house behind them. Random force number 9, Mr. Slate. Mr. Slate rummaged around the cobweb-covered basement. Filled with bittersweet nostalgia that can only come from someone acknowledging who they used to be. Among the few things that had survived the fire, there was a baseball signed by the entire Tampa Bay team. He had thrown it into a box along with a few other signed knickknacks, but since everything in the box still smelled like smoke, he had stored it in the basement because of the memory of the fire overwhelmed any positive memories associated with the items. Only now that he had his own personal fan did he even remember the baseball. Since Nick and Danny had grown up with it as just a decoration on the shelf, it didn't mean much to them. But he knew it might impress Theodore. If only he could remember which box it was in. I'll be back in a second, he shouted up the stairs. I almost got it. Then he reached for the farthest box, never knowing his hand was passing through a series of spider webs and disrupting the peace of several highly affronted black widows. And random force number 10, Nick. While Caitlin tried to figure out where the set of rollers fit into the device they were constructing, Nick went downstairs to see what all the commotion was about. He found Petula running up and down the stairs with the neighbor woman. Up this way, Petula told her. The old woman huffed and puffed as she hurried up the stairs, only to be told at the top that she had to race down instead. Although Petula was Colorado Springs' ambassador of the abnormal, this was bizarre even for her. What are you trying to do? Nick said. Give the poor woman a heart attack? Shush, said Petula. It's our little secret. Nick grabbed Petula and pulled her down the stairs and out of the front door, bumping into the cable guy who was also leaving. Nick, shouted Danny, bursting with joy, we have 692 channels. You want to watch them? Kind of busy now, Nick responded. You start and I'll catch up. I'll watch with him, said Vince. Channel surfing is the only sport I excel in. In fact, someday I hope to go pro. Once out on the lawn, Nick didn't give Petula a chance to launch into anything but the truth. Tell me what's up with you, he demanded in simple English, with no Petulisms. Petula took a deep breath before she leveled this tasty little tidbit at him. Someone in your house is going to die today. Never mind how, I know. I just do. I came to save your life. So the least you could do is be grateful. Die? What do you mean die? Well, off the top of my head, there are 3 definitions I can think of, but none of the others are verbs. Get it? Nick put the 2 and 2 together. The camera you got at the garage sale? Never mind that. It tells you the future? Never mind that. Then she froze, and Nick followed her gaze to the driveway, where the cable guy was backing out way too quickly, never seeing the old woman and her dog behind him. Hey, watch out, Nick shouted. The old woman looked up, saw the truck, and jumped out of the way just in time. The truck rolled over the dog, but as it was such a small animal, the truck's belly passed over it, leaving the sweatered pug unharmed, but even more annoyed than usual. Why did you just do that? Petula yelled at Nick. This whole thing could have been over. But no, you had to save the old lady. So I was supposed to just let her get flattened? Yes, Petula told him. Better her than me, or you, or anyone else in your house. Nick didn't have time to argue the logic of death prophecies. He turned and ran back inside with Petula close behind, clicking the odds back to 1 in 8. Mitch had never been accused of clairvoyance or of being in any way in touch with the ripplings of the supernatural frequency. Indeed, he had trouble with the radio tuner in his mother's car. But perhaps his symbiotic relationship with the Shut Up and Listen had fine-tuned his metaphysical awareness so that now he felt a palpable sense of foreboding. foreboding. Or perhaps it was just Petula announcing that someone was going to die. While everything around him was hectic, nothing looked particularly deadly, except perhaps the deadly volume of the TV, which Nick's little brother didn't seem to be able to control. I can't change the channels either, Danny said to Vince, sitting next to him on the sofa. This thing is broken already. And then he banged the remote on the coffee table. Vince practically had no screen over the TV. It probably just needs batteries. Give it to me. The TV and the conversation were so loud that Mitch felt his heart began to race. He sucked harder on the jawbreaker and almost reflexively pulled the string on the shut and listen. What should I do? Mitch began and released the string. But the TV was so loud he couldn't hear the answer. So, putting the device right up to his ear, he pulled the string again. What should I do? And the machine said, "Is get out now." Mitch was so shocked that he gasped, causing the jawbreaker in his mouth to roll back down his tongue toward his uvula, which stood like a single upside-down pin in a bowling alley. And Mitch was about to score a spare. For Petula, there was no feeling worse than helplessness. To know that something beyond a shadow of a doubt, and also know that she couldn't stop or control it. She had tried, but that blasted old woman simply wouldn't die. Nick, no! She ran after him as she reached the front door, hoping that the adrenaline rush might give her the strength to grab him and hurl him across the lawn safely. Instead, as she followed him inside the house, she had just enough adrenaline to make her walk a little bit too quickly, catch her foot on the threshold of the front door, and fall headlong toward a golden spike that seemed specifically placed there to impale her. Down in the basement, Mr. Slate finally wrapped his hand around something cool and round. The familiar feel of a baseball in his hand was a sense memory that always brought back a flood of good feelings. Theodore would most certainly be impressed by it. Perhaps, thought Mr. Slate, he could tell him about the time he had pitched a no-hitter against the Cubs. There'd be no mention of Whiffin' Wayne today. Wayne Slate was blessed, or cursed, as it were, with a sizable coat of arm hair, a nuisance when reaching through spaces, crisscrossed with sticky webs, and right now his arm was practically cocooned in the stuff. But that was only the half of it. There comes a time in every man's life when he must face the spider of his nightmares. But in Wayne Slate's case, bad luck came in threes. Theo had no particular interest in a baseball signed by the Rays, except perhaps for the cash he could get for it on eBay, should the opportunity arise. Nevertheless, ogling it in Mr. Slate's presence would endear him to the man and solidify his presence as a friend of the family. Caitlin's reaction was already priceless, and the dividends of this venture could only grow. Proof of the old adage, success is the pest's revenge. He had nothing but high hopes as he dipped a skewer of chicken sauté into a curious beige sauce that smelled nothing like peanuts, and he lifted it toward his mouth. Caitlin was aware of none of this, as she was alone upstairs in the attic and was only now beginning to wonder what was keeping Nick. By the looks of the half-built device before her, there were at least a dozen pieces still missing, but perhaps it didn't need every piece to work, or at least to partially work. For the life of her, however, she couldn't figure out where the hair curlers fit. She opened the case and pondered them, 6 bluish-gray cylinders made of tightly coiled wire. Perhaps, she thought, the case was just a holder, and the coils fit on the device individually. If that were so, all she had to do was remove them from the case and find out where to insert them. As she reached for one of the coils, it didn't occur to her that this electrical transformers were made of coiled wire, and that those made of tempered tantalum and designed by Nikola Tesla might be several degrees beyond deadly. In fact, touching them with bare hands would be far worse than being struck by lightning again. The fact that the cable guy had left the TV in less than perfect working condition infuriated Danny. He continued banging the remote on the table, venting his frustrations at the stupid thing. "Dad!" he shouted. "Do we have batteries?" He tried to pry open the battery compartment, but it wouldn't budge. He didn't know whether it took AA or AAA. Or one of those stupid little square ones that are supposed to make smoke detectors work, but obviously didn't work well enough to keep their mom alive. For this reason, Danny hated batteries with a passion, so he kept banging the remote on the table while Vince went to the TV to lower the volume the old-fashioned way. Nick came in all upset about something and looked at Danny like the blaring volume was his fault. "Turn that thing down," he yelled, as if Danny hadn't already tried, but before Danny could say anything, Nick grabbed the remote from him and tried it himself. "Fine," thought Danny. "Let him get the batteries." Exasperated, he hurled himself backward onto the old sofa, which once more giving rise to a cloud of ancient dust, and once more shaking the portrait of great Aunt Greta, this time hard enough to knock it off the wall. Although Nick had no way of knowing this, the moment he grabbed the remote from Danny was the moment of convergence of multiple cosmic strings of human fate. Mitch had felt it coming, but now he was much more preoccupied trying to give himself the Heimlich maneuver. Petula caught a glimpse of it in the telltale print from her camera, but right now she was much more interested in a certain metallic object toward which her body was falling, which might or might not pierce her heart. All Nick knew as he aimed the remote at the TV and hit the power button was that all hell broke loose. A picture came crashing down from the wall behind him. Mitch hurled himself at the corner of the end table, and Nick's father burst up from the basement screaming like a little girl. Many lives were saved that day because of Mr. Slate's high-octave scream, which was substantially higher than a blasting TV. The scream made Caitlin drop the curler container in the attic, and the curlers rolled on the floor, sparking and sizzling, a warning not to be touched. The scream made Theo freeze an instant before he put the lethal peanut sauce in his mouth, and the scream made Danny jump up from the sofa just as a huge oak picture frame crashed down on the spot where he had been sitting. As for Mitch, the corner of the end table did the trick. It sent the jawbreaker flying toward the front door, where it ricocheted off the golden spike, not powerfully enough to knock it over, but enough to move it slightly off center, so that as Petula came down on it, it didn't pierce her heart, but instead tore her blouse and gave her a nasty scrape on her side. In the kitchen, Theo, thinking quickly, used his uneaten chicken satay skewer to scrape the surly black widows from Mr. Slate's arm before they bit him, and they were quickly crunched underfoot. And in the living room, the TV blared as Nick's attempt to turn it off had absolutely no effect, at least not on the TV. Vince had never liked the childhood games they made him play in kindergarten. Even then, he'd had enough objectivity to notice that almost all of them were designed to isolate and or humiliate a single child, namely him. Someone is always left holding the hot potato. There are lots of ducks, but only one goose. Some poor slob has to be it, and as everyone knows, the cheese stands alone. Somewhere along the way, Vince decided to embrace it, and he made dark isolation a badge of honor. As far as he was concerned, today's unpleasant turn of events was just an extension of a running theme. The universe was singling him out as it once again. Vince had no way of knowing that the remote would not work for Danny because it was coded to Nick's bioelectrical fingerprint, so it would only work for him. Vince also had no way of knowing that it was not programmed for Lifeline Cable's 692 channels because it didn't come from Lifeline Cable. It was a gift of the Accelerati. And when Nick hit the power button, it shut down Vince's heart, just as it had done to poor Mr. Svedberg. There was never any hope. Vince was dead before he hit the ground. Chapter 22, as seen on TV. "No!" Nick realized a moment too late what had happened. He felt the strange invisible pulse leave the remote when he pressed the off button, and he instinctively knew this was no ordinary device. Vince had been at the TV trying to lower the volume manually. He was directly in the line of the bioelectrical pulse. Nick dropped the device and ran to him. He did not know CPR, he had only seen it on TV. Still, he desperately tried chest compressions until his father arrived. Mr. Slate didn't know CPR either, but he had the benefit of seeing it on TV for many more years. He tried while Caitlin, who watched in horror from the stairs, pulled out her phone to dial 911. When it was clear there was nothing they could do for Vince, Nick felt his rage turn from the device to the one person who had known that death was coming to Nick's door. Petula was still nursing her own wound when Nick stormed toward her. It had only just registered with her that Vince was the one who died, not her. But she found her relief to be short-lived. "You knew!" Nick yelled at her. "You knew, and you did nothing to stop it." "I didn't know what would happen," she tried to explain. "I just knew something would. And I couldn't have stopped it even if I tried." "That doesn't matter," he screamed. "Even if there's nothing you can do, even if it's hopeless, you try, and you don't stop trying. You're the one responsible for his death." She attempted to reason with him, to explain that you can't change a picture in the future. The best you can hope to do is frame it. But no matter what she said, Nick blamed her. This was not the turn of events that Petula was expecting. When Death's scythe came swinging down, she thought Nick would finally understand and be grateful, that he would see how deeply she cared, for she had risked her own life to come here and save him. But instead, "Get out of here," Nick groaned. "Get out, or I swear to you there'll be two bodies to be hauled away." And although Petula knew from her photograph that such an outcome was impossible, she said, "Well, all right then. I guess I'll be going." And then she turned and left quickly before anyone could see her tears. After Petula left, Nick turned back to the terrible scene only once before he experienced the all-consuming revelation that something unthinkable and irreversible had happened, something that would change him and his life forever. Immediately he was brought back to the aftermath of the fire, standing there helplessly on the lawn as his father raced toward the porch after his mother, the porch exploding before he could get there. The flames, like the gates of hell themselves, had opened up to consume everything. Nick knew. And here again was a shell shock that didn't numb him but made him hyper aware of everything going on around him. The sound of his father's grunts as he tried hopeless chest compressions on Vince's limp form, the sound of Caitlin's sobs as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher, Mitch standing just a few feet away, having pulled the string on his stupid machine, but too afraid to let go or even start a sentence, and the back door slamming as Theo slipped out to avoid any blame that might be cast. Danny picked up the remote and looked to Nick for an explanation. Nick just slapped it out of his hand. The remote hadn't worked for Danny, and Nick instinctively knew that it was designed for Nick's use and Nick's use alone. No, the Accelerati wouldn't kill him, but their warning was to kill someone close to him, anyone close to him, by his own hand. Something told Nick, just as it had when his mother had died, that this was the end of the world. But this time it was more than just a voice inside him. Raging above this living room tragedy was a television that could not be silenced, and the newscaster, looking far more serious than newscasters usually do, spoke of something that made the death of Nick's friend seem insignificant when compared to the big picture. The world was, indeed, about to end at the cold, stony hands of Felicity Bonk.